It's time to master the marathon. That's right, we're going to take on one of the most difficult races, well, sometimes considered the ultimate challenge in running. And I'm going to walk you through everything from tapering to pacing to fueling to what to eat to caffeine ingestion to temperature regulation to the psychology of the marathon itself. So we're going to talk about, as we get to race day, how to set yourself up to perform up to your potential. And we're going to talk from elite to recreational athlete. Why can I tell you this stuff? I'm an exercise scientist, but more so, I've spent my career coaching the marathon. I've coached over, I think, 24 Olympic trials qualifiers in the marathon. So we're gonna, including top 10 people at the World Championships, Boston, New York City, all of that good stuff. So let's dive into it. So first, what I want to cover is tapering. This is the question I get all the time, and we're not in another video. We'll go into how to train for the marathon, but what do we do in the weeks leading up to the race? Well, the research is helpful, but it doesn't determine everything here. And what the research basically shows is that if you have a plan, it is better than not having a plan. Surprise, surprise. But in general, with recreational athletes, what it shows is that a longer gradual taper works better. So a 3-week taper that is planned out tends to work better than a big drop with 1 week to go. There's some research on elite athletes that shows similar, but I'm going to caution you and say that a lot of the taper depends where you're at going into the taper. Because what we know from the fitness fatigue model is that essentially when it comes to race day, what we're trying to do is all the training, keeping our fitness up, so maintaining our fitness, while taking the foot off the gas just enough to take away the fatigue so we can express that fitness. We don't want to take our foot all the way off the gas so that when we start losing some of that fitness or detraining. So it's this delicate balance. So I'm going to give you a couple keys that I think are really important. Number one, keep the routine. If you're used to running 7 days a week, then run 7 days a week. Again, sometimes we can, modify it a little bit, 6 days instead of 7. But the point is keep the routine. In that, what we're doing is just modifying those runs to be a little bit shorter. And the reason here is because what sometimes happens when we taper is our brain and our body overreact. It says for the elite athlete, oh, you've been running 80, 90, 100 miles a week for a while. You start to run 50 or 40 and you just make that big jump. It's almost like your body goes like, it's off season. We're shutting down. Like, chill out. So what does it look like? So let's keep it simple, okay? So 3 weeks out, maybe on a volume standard, we're dropping to 90 to 80% of our volume. 2 weeks out, maybe 70-ish% of our volume. And then 1 week is 60 to 50%, depending on the athlete. And again, we talk in percentages, and I kind of like that, but that varies a lot because if you're running 100 miles a week, you're dropping to 60 miles a week, which still is a decent amount. If you're, running 40 miles a week, you're dropping to 20 miles a week by that last week, and that's not running too much. So it depends on that recreational level. I probably have them not drop percentage-wise quite as much because I need to keep that stimulus there to adapt. So again, don't get caught up in the percentages. In terms of workouts, what does it look like tapering intensity? 3 weeks out, I like to have a pretty solid, strong workout. So marathon specific, maybe not quite as far, but still something that's going pretty dang good. So maybe 3 by 4 miles at marathon pace with a mile steady or easy in between, right? Something where you're still getting some good volume and it's hitting us pretty hard. And then we go that 2 weeks out. What I'll generally do is a workout at 90% intensity, meaning something is compared to when we're in our peak intensity phase that we're doing about 90% of that volume of it. And then about 10 days out, we'll do something that is shorter and faster, because within about 10 days to 2 weeks, you're not getting better. You're not adapting in time. All we're trying to do is keep the systems going. So we do something a little bit longer in marathon specific. We do something a little bit faster that just like primes the pump. A week out, what I'll generally do is like a mini long run, where if they were used to doing 18 to 20, we might do, 13. And we'll do the first half or 60, 70% of that, maybe 8 miles with the last 5, gradual progression. Okay, so starting out slower than marathon pace and then finishing at marathon pace or a little bit faster. It's just priming that pump. And then the week of, I call it doing stuff to feel good and remind your body that you have to work a little hard and run fast. So things like breakdowns where we might do 10 minutes at marathon pace and then some minute on, minute off, or maybe some 30 seconds on, minute off, where again, we're not running crazy fast, maybe at 10K effort, but just to remind yourself like, hey, we got to keep this going, prime the pump. And that's what happens from the intensity standpoint. So again, don't get caught up in the percentages of volume decrease, intensity increase. Remember to focus on the frequency and keeping that routine. So that's going to be really important. And then it depends on what you're coming in with it. All right, so let's move on. It's race day, or about what are we going to do in terms of pacing? So this is where beginner novices often screw it up. Okay, so here's what I want you to think of. Pacing, your brain is predictive, meaning what it does is it has a mental model and expectation of what it should feel like at various points of the race, right? The start should feel relatively easy. At mile 10, it should still feel relatively comfortable. At mile 18, it's starting to get hard and you got to focus. And what happens is when we compare our mental model, our expectations, versus the reality that we're facing. So if it feels harder than we predicted or our expectations were, we feel more fatigue and we tend to slow down. If it feels easier, we might feel like, hey, maybe I can push it a little bit. So what does that mean? To me, it means setting the right expectations and giving your brain the right predictions, and that comes into pacing and setting yourself up. So generally when we look at pacing and setting the right expectations, we want either a negative split or an even split. No one wants a positive split marathon. Okay, depending on the terrain. But what we have here is a problem. Is generally an even split marathon might be best to maximize your performance, but it means you need to be aware and dialed in so you can ride that line. If you are an elite performer or experienced performer, you can try to do that. You have the experience, you know what you're looking for, you can internally adjust based on the feedback. And aiming for a relatively even split can work out well. If you're a novice, beginner, or someone who doesn't have that experience, I would say a negative split run, which means get through halfway, feeling good, a little slower than goal pace, and then say, okay, based on how I'm going to feel after I get through halfway, then I can start thinking. Or depending on the individual, maybe it's get through 15 miles or 16 miles until you start to be able to smell the finish line a little bit. Pacing is where you can make or break a marathon. And all I'll say is this, is in the training leading up to it, you need to dial in your pacing ability, and then you need to dial in reading your internal feedback ability, meaning how your muscles are feeling, how your breathing is, what it should feel like on race day that is sustainable. That's what those marathon pace workouts are for, not just the physiological adaptations, but understanding and learning to tune into your body so you can adjust as you go. But simplified, negative split is the safest route. Even split, if you want to ride that line and you feel comfortable doing so. How do you determine your marathon pace? It comes from workouts, right? Workouts guide things. Looking at your long runs, looking at your marathon pace specific work where you're doing long tempos or long steady runs or broken things like 3 by 5 miles at marathon pace and seeing, okay, what paces are those at? And do I think I could sustain that? Okay. That gives you the feedback for dialing in where your pacing should be. So use the workouts. Hey y'all, I'm super excited to announce my new book, Win the Inside Game. It's all about improving your mental performance and teaching you how to come through in the clutch. As a special offer for my YouTube audience, I'm going to give you some pre-order bonuses. Order today and you get my 100-page ebook, The Elements and Principles of Coaching. You'll also get guides to training, running a fast 5K, and all sorts of great stuff. So if you're interested, check out the links in the description to order today. All right, so we've got pacing, we've got a plan coming into it. Let's talk about fueling. The complicated thing of fueling. All right, so let's break it down here. At marathon pace, we're using largely glycogen with, depending on the intensity and the duration, so a 2-hour marathon versus 4-hour marathon is going to differ. Some combination of some glycogen plus a little bit of fat. But the basic gist of the marathon is it's a fuel economy battle. Meaning you're trying to run at an intensity that burns fuel just efficiently enough so that you can reach the finish line without running out. And here's the other secret. No one ever runs out of glycogen. Even those who elite of the elite, going for it, maybe even bonk, there's still some left in the tank. What the brain does is it essentially takes feedback and says, hey, based on my current burn rate, intensity, with how much longer I have to go, am I looking to run close to empty? It's almost like your car has that fuel, gauge, and then that predictive thing where it says, hey, you have 200 miles to E, 150 to E. Well, your car, if you've ever done this, probably when you're younger, you can go past zero. So the car gets to zero and you still have gas in the tank. Why does it do that? It warns you because your car knows, the manufacturer knows we're idiots and someone's going to run it to zero. So it wants to make it sure it has a little safety in there so that you don't run out of gas on the side of the road. Our brain is kind of similar, except it uses fatigue and effort to warn us we're running closer to E than the actual number. So as fatigue increases, what happens is our brain's saying, hey, you're burning more than you might be able to last here. We don't want to reach zero, so we're going to increase that effort or that pain or that fatigue so that you slow down your burn rate, okay? So what does this mean from a fueling standpoint? Well, the typical person has, again, it varies between 500 and 800 grams of carbs stored in the muscle. We've got another 80 grams in the liver. That lasts us, again, depending on the intensity and some other factors, like around 2 hours to maybe 3 hours, depending on the person. Some of that is supplemented by fat, again, depending on the pace. Not a lot the faster we go because the intensity is so high. Okay, so we've got to figure out what can we do to maximize that storage of both muscle and liver, and then supplement that with things like goo, gel, drinks that are essentially giving our body sugar to maintain not only blood sugar levels, but also take up some of the load so it's not just on stored glycogen. So let's go into that now that we understand it a little bit. So there's this idea of carbo loading. You take in a lot of carbs beforehand to maximize your muscle glycogen stores. This comes from research way back in the day in the 70s that really pioneered this. And in the original studies, what they did is they went through a depletion stage where you essentially went low carb, depleted your stores, and then went crazy high carb and super compensated. That works. But what we now know is we don't need that depletion stage. Why? Because training largely takes care of it to a degree. Your glycogen stores, when you're training at a decent level for the marathon, aren't fully restored. So we don't need the depletion stage. And it was a pain in the ass and pretty uncomfortable in the days leading into a marathon. Instead, What it generally means is we can eat high carbohydrate meals for the day or two before the race. You don't have to go crazy, but just some good pasta and other things. And that will get us most of the way there, if not the entirety of the way there. So in the day leading up to it, think of how can I get easily digestible carbs that aren't going to make me feel maybe bloated or give me GI stuff or whatever have you, and do that. And that's the key. Okay, when we look at breakfast the morning of, so the important here is the liver glycogen stores. So overnight, our liver glycogen stores drop. And even though there's only about 80 grams, that's significant when we come into, hey, we're going to run out of glycogen stores. What does that mean? Is we need some sort of breakfast to restore what we lost in our overnight fast. Not only liver, but a little bit of muscle glycogen. We need something like 100 to 200 grams of carbs 3 to 4 hours before a race. Now, if you have some GI issues or anything like that, like you might just have that mostly through drinks or simple carbohydrates, totally fine. Whatever you can withstand in the morning is key. Why do we say 3 to 4 hours? So we can have some time to digest beforehand. Sometimes it can be a little less. Okay, you're getting ready for the marathon. What else? So a couple of different things here. If you've eaten a meal 3-4 hours before, you can have a goo or a gel 15 to 30 minutes before the race to top off. It's called a preload. We used to think you'd have a reactive hypoglycemia. Doesn't happen. The research has switched that. So if you want, you can top off with either a goo or gel, a little bit of Gatorade or a drink 15 to 30 minutes before we're just sipping on it to top things off between your breakfast and race, time. Now let's talk about during the race. Okay. So we're burning through our glycogen stores in our muscles and our liver, but we can augment that through supplementing by fueling. So goos, gels, drinks, all of that good stuff. So a couple things here. First off, what we know is that in the past, we used to think that this was relatively limited. Meaning you could top off at maybe 60 grams an hour of carbohydrate. So that could be from goos or gels or drinks or what have you. About 60 grams an hour, and that was it. Now, what we know is 60 grams is good. Often elites try and get 90 grams an hour. And in some of the data, you see, especially in cycling, cyclists get 100 grams plus, or mountain ultra runners, there's some data that shows that some have gotten 120 grams an hour. Now, the more that we consume, the more potential GI issues we have, that kind of cramping that you get in your stomach. So that's key. We'll come back to that. Why can we consume more? Because of what research has uncovered, which is this, is we have different types of sugars. Here's what I want you to think of, is glucose has like a specific highway delivering the fuel. What we now know is that different sugars like fructose can come through a different highway. We can build a different highway to the same endpoint or same destination. In the research, I'm not going to make it complicated, but what they found is that glucose and fructose have different transporter systems to get into the cell. So there's, I think it's SGLT1 for glucose and then GLUT5 for fructose, if I remember correctly. They get in the cell in a different way. So that means what happens is glucose is limited to 60 grams an hour. If you go higher than that in terms of the glucose you're consuming, it's like a traffic jam. It gets backed up. Any extra you're not using, it can't get through the gut. Okay? But fructose comes through a different transporter, different road. So even if we're 60 grams here, we can get another 30 or 40 or 50 or even 60 grams through fructose. Same thing if you look at the combinations that work, is generally glucose to fructose Sometimes you'll see research on maltodextrin and fructose, or glucose, sucrose, fructose combos. So basically you want a combination here. And the research tells us this, in order for that combination to work, we essentially have to max out our glucose, so 60 grams, and then we need to tap on the other stuff. So if we don't have much glucose in there, it's not going to have this benefit. This is why for a while the kind of magic ratio was 2-to-1 glucose to fructose. So 60 grams, 30 grams, essentially. There's no magic in that ratio, but it's just we need to max out that amount of glucose for the rest to occur. So simplifying, okay, what does that mean? What you need to do in the marathon is look at your gels, your Gatorades, or your combos and see how much of these different sugars do they provide, and then how often am I going to take them? And you can work it out because you have, let's say, 90 grams an hour of sugars, 60 from glucose, 30 from fructose, for example. And you say, okay, every 20 minutes, maybe I take a gel every 20 minutes, like how much do I need there? Or every 15 minutes, whatever it is, something like that. It's going to vary again, and that can be combination drink and gel or whatever suits you. Okay, here's the caveat on all of this, is that if I just tell you to go take 60 grams per hour of sugar, or 90, you're going to have GI issues. The good news is this, is just like the muscles, the gut is trainable. So in your training for the marathon, what you need to do is start with 20 grams an hour, 30 grams an hour, 45, 60, and build it up to where you're comfortable with it. And whatever you reach in terms of the max in training, where you're comfortable on those longer runs or longer steady efforts, that's what you do, okay? You don't go crazy after that, all right? Another thing that I want to tell you is if you feel like, hey, I can't consume more, especially later in the race where I'm maxed out and it takes time to digest, so later in the race it might not help maybe at that mile 23 or 24 where there's an aid station or whatever have you, is there's some data that swishing and spitting, so if we swish and spit a Gatorade or a carb drink, what happens is we have these receptors in our mouth that essentially signal to the brain, that in the gut, that, hey, sugar is coming, it's okay, and that will actually make us feel better. So later in the race, if you're feeling full or you can't digest stuff, still swish and spit, because it will trick your brain to think that, okay, fuel's coming, take the reins off a little bit. So keep that in mind as well. The other thing that I want to mention here is caffeine. So caffeine in the marathon does have a performance advantage effect, okay? The keys to consider here are that caffeine, when you take it, on average, it varies a lot, but it generally will take between 30 to 60 minutes to absorb, sometimes up to 90 minutes, but 30 to 60 is pretty good. So the way I like to think of my caffeine dose is you can take it once, you can take it twice, generally probably not more than that, is how do I want to time those doses? So think of it like this. If I'm running a 2.5 hour marathon, I don't want to take my caffeine dose 90 minutes into it because it might peak right when I'm hitting the finish. So think of it as like maybe you take some early in the race to give you a slight boost, and then you time it so that second dose is to help you in the crunch time. Maybe at mile 20, 22, those periods where it's like you need that extra focus and attention. So think of it as like your last dose is about 30 to 60 minutes, maybe 40 to 60 minutes before like you're going to be in that pain blocker. How much caffeine should you take in total? Research tells us between basically 3 and 5 milligrams per kilogram. Okay. Again, this is helpful when you play around with it and see what works. All right, so we've gone through the fueling, we've done the pacing. I just want to talk briefly about temperature regulation. So this is really important if you're running in a hot environment. So what limits you shifts from maybe just fuel to also body temperature. So as your body temperature rises, again, it's predictive. If you're going up and up and up, your brain goes like, hey, we need to shut this person down. deactivate, make it where he can't recruit any more muscle fibers, slow him down so that like we're not getting hotter, so that we can survive. What comes into play here? Hydration, cooling, meaning dumping cold water or wearing a hat with ice in it, pre-cooling into a race or workout, meaning wearing an ice vest, or even there's some research of sitting in a cold tub before you race because it pre-cools yourself. So the hotter the environment, the more we have to look at hydration because you're going to be having higher degrees of sweat loss. Okay? Hydration and then some sort of cooling effect. Again, sometimes it's just simply cold water on your face, on your head, on the back of your head to signal to your brain that like, hey, it's okay, we're not going to overheat. Sometimes it's using pre-cooling, sometimes it's using ice or carrying ice in a rag and putting it around you. Whatever helps you, anything that can cool your body down helps. And then finally, I just want to briefly touch on the psychology of running the marathon. It's really important that your expectations are right. We talked earlier about your brain is predictive. You shape that. So if you go into it and think, hey, I've got this, no problem, when reality smacks you in the face, it's going to hit you hard and your brain's going to go to panic mode. If alternatively you think like, this is the hardest thing I've ever done, I'm never going to be able to do it, what happens is you're never going to reach your potential because your brain's going to be in kind of panic mode from the beginning and you're going to go out extra cautious to make sure that you don't hurt or don't hit the wall. So the key here is appropriate expectations. What also helps here is having multiple goals and not all of them being outcome-based. In fact, we need some process-based goals. Why? Because if your only goal is to Boston qualify or run sub 2:30 or sub 3 hours or what have you, if that slips away, your brain goes from the goal is in reach to what's the point mode. Okay. Other things is train and practice your coping strategies. Meaning, how are you going to get through this amount of time where you're going to need to be focused at times, and sometimes you're going to need to learn how to turn your brain off for a while. So turning your brain off means like figuring out how to maybe distract early in races or just think about other things or what have you. It also means zooming in and being able to focus during those moments where it's like, hey, this really sucks. What I found works really well here is having a lot of different tactics and tools. Everything from being able to break it down, meaning if you're at mile 16 and starting to hurt, you don't think, oh, I've got 10 plus more miles. You think, make it to the next turn, make it to the next, mile. Just focus on that, and then we'll worry about what's to come. It also means having reminders of why you're doing it. So this is why people sometimes write things on their hands or have special bracelets or what have you, is in the thick of it, you need to remember why you signed up for this thing and why it's important for you to push through and finish. The other thing that is really important here is you're gonna have bad stretches. But unlike maybe some shorter races, you can come out of those. So you can have a bad stretch for a mile or two, and then for whatever reason, if you make it through, your body starts coming back around. Or maybe it feels like you're so far from the finish, and then your brain starts to smell the finish, and it says, oh, okay, we'll make it, we'll be okay. So understanding, accepting you're gonna have some bad patches, figuring out how to navigate those, and then realizing that it can turn around. A lot of different strategies there, but the most important thing is practicing different regulation, coping strategies during practice, during training, leading up to it. If you have more tools in your toolkit, you're gonna be better off. All right, so we've gone through a lot on marathon race day. Hopefully that gives you some insight into pacing, tapering, fueling, caffeine use, the psychology, a little on temperature regulation, and the science of preparing for a marathon. Marathons are hard. Even if you know all this and you perfect it, you might not get it right, and that's okay. That's part of the challenge, is that when a race is that long, You never know what's going to be the limiting factor, and you never not know what's going to go right or wrong. But every time you learn, you grow, and you adapt. So use these strategies to improve your marathon performance. I hope you found them useful. If you did, consider subscribing, following along, commenting on it. If you have any questions about anything that I said or other questions that you'd like covered on performing in a marathon.